1988, midwives' role in detecting and managing the fetus at risk. And it's really important to understand that monitoring fetal movements is a form of fetal surveillance just as important as a CTG. Probably even more so because the mother is with the baby 24/7. So at the end of this presentation, I would hope that you would agree that any change, whether that be reduced, increase, any change at all, in fetal movements warrants investigation by us. That you will believe that it is never, ever appropriate to delay fetal assessment of the woman if she is concerned, and to name some warning signs of the fetus at risk of stillbirth. I see some of you taking notes, and that's perfect. So, the first point is monitoring fetal movements is a form of fetal surveillance, and it is a way of the fetus letting us know whether they are okay. So that brings me to, oh dear, that first question that we ask women probably post 28 weeks is your baby moving? Who's asked that question? Lots of hands in the room. I'd like to propose to you that instead of asking, is your baby moving, that it's much better to ask, tell me about your baby's movements. Why do you reckon that I'm saying that to you?
Because then they describe it in more detail.
Terrific. They may describe it in more detail. So if you ask, is your baby moving, all you're going to get is yes or no, because it's a yes or no question. Whereas if you say, tell me about your baby's movements, then she'll tell you about her baby's movements. And if she doesn't know, there's an opportunity for you to say, you can get to know your baby. And so get to know your baby over the next couple of weeks and come back so that you can tell me about your baby's movements. So asking the woman to tell you about her baby's movements empowers her to be aware of who her baby is, how her baby is, and to immediately report to you if there's a change. A lot of women don't actually realise that their baby has personality in utero. And one of the really fantastic pictures that I've seen recently is this one at the bottom of the screen, where you see an unborn baby and that same baby, newborn, adopting the same pose. You can tell it's the same baby. Its hands are in the same place. It's doing the same thing. So asking the woman to get to know who her baby is a way of her getting to know who her baby is going to be as her baby, when her baby is born and as her baby grows. How her baby is her opportunity to get to know how her baby is. Is her baby a morning person? Is her baby an evening person? Is her baby a social person? What's her baby like? Ask her how her baby is, and then instruct her to immediately report a change to you. So if her baby suddenly starts moving less or more, you need to know. So why do we need to know? There's lots and lots of evidence that suggests that decreased fetal movements is a warning sign. And I think you all know that, yeah? So there's two particular studies which show that women who report decreased fetal movements are at increased risk of adverse perinatal outcome, such as growth restriction and stillbirth. Interestingly, Stacey, who did a New Zealand study, reported that women who experience a late-term stillbirth presented with decreased fetal movements at some time during their pregnancy versus only 9% of live-born controls. So it's a warning sign for sure. I'm often asked if awareness of decreased fetal movements can be protective against stillbirth. And we know this because a large multi-centred randomised controlled trial conducted in both the United Kingdom and France, 68,000 women participated, all risk, so not high risk, not low risk, all risk. Entire clinics were recruited. And in those days, it was conducted in 1989, in those days we asked the women to count to 10 and the time that it took them to count to 10 in a day versus usual care. And the whole reason why they put this randomised controlled trial together was that across the globe we were using kick charts in the 80s and earlier, in fact. And we would hand out these kick charts at 28 weeks, and we would say to the woman, count to 10 and record on the kick chart when you get to that number 10. Bring it back for your next appointment, and together we'll have a look at what your baby is doing. Well, some of those kick charts obviously were completed the night before the woman came in for antenatal care because there was just dots across the same time every day. And then other times it was widely varied. So the woman counted to 10 and that was achieved 9 o'clock in the morning or 9 o'clock at night. So there was all this sort of variety. So that they really meant nothing as far as fetal well-being went. And this particular study found that there was no difference in the stillbirth rate between the groups. And everyone across the globe heaved a sigh of relief and chucked out the charts. And it took many years later, actually, just recently, 5 years ago, one person actually noticed that the stillbirth rate fell across the cohort. So both the people who counted to 10 and those in the usual care group, both of them experienced a drop in stillbirth, quite a significant drop, from an expected 4 per thousand to 2.8 per thousand. And 2.8 is actually better than our current stillbirth rate in Australia. So it's quite substantial, the improvement. So this suggests that either being enrolled in a randomised controlled trial is protective for stillbirth, or that awareness of decreased fetal movements is protective for stillbirth. And we think, obviously, that it's that. So yes, awareness of decreased fetal movements can be protective against stillbirth. Does telling women about decreased fetal movements make them more anxious and more work for us? Who thinks yes? Nobody. That's awesome. Maybe. The study for the evidence for this is a study out of Norway that Vet and others did in 2009, where they looked at a before and after intervention, and they looked at stillbirth rate. So it was quite a large study as well. They gave the women written information, including information about how to monitor fetal movements. And then they had a standardised management of decreased fetal movements for healthcare professionals. So they gave them consistent advice and investigated the baby. And what they found was that the reports of decreased fetal movements did not increase during the intervention. Interesting that it didn't actually increase. The rates of ultrasound increased. So that was the care providers actually doing a bit better job investigating. But follow-up and admission for induction of labour actually reduced. So they investigated, they saw what the baby was up to, and then they didn't tend to induce. The stillbirth rate fell from an expected 3 per thousand. Norway currently has one of the lowest stillbirth rates in the world, to 2 per thousand, so a very significant drop. And there was no increase in preterm birth, small for gestational age, nursery admission. So this tells us that if you talk to women about decreased fetal movements in pregnancy, it doesn't make them anxious because they don't present more. It empowers them, it gives them information and knowledge. When do I present? And if we follow up appropriately, then the women being knowledgeable and us being appropriate means that the stillbirth rate drops. Very important information to know. So I'm going to talk to you about signs that the fetus sends us that they may be at risk, because it's more than decreased fetal movements, as you'll find out. I want to tell you about a study that I've been involved in since 2011 called the STARS study. and it's got a very nice little acronym, Study of the Trends and Associated Risks for Stillbirth. And it was funded by a group in the US called the Star Legacy Foundation. So the whole STARS thing is all very serendipitous, I guess. So it was an online survey, a cohort study designed with a nested case control arm. And the cohort study was 1,700 women who had experienced stillbirth anything more than 3 weeks prior. And some of the women who told us about their stillbirth had had a stillbirth many years before. And then we had a case control study, which is currently under review, where we had 153 cases who'd had a stillbirth less than 3 weeks prior, so very recent, and 480 controls who'd had a recent live birth or indeed still pregnant, so that we could see differences between what the cases who'd had a stillbirth told us and what the controls who'd had a live birth told us. So the cohort study, which we've published, gave us this information, which is really very interesting, and that is that if you have a look at the very top figure there, 28%, said that there was no change in fetal movement. So that's interesting because, and it's something for us to be aware of, a baby who's going to be stillborn doesn't necessarily change fetal movement. It's just a really strong warning sign, but it's only one of a number of things that the baby might do or not do. So then as we move down, we can see that 46.4% of them had a little less movement or significantly less movement, and 16% reckoned they had a bit more movement or significantly more movement, which is really interesting. Tell you more about that in a second, but basically what we've got is 2/3 of women saying that there was some change in their baby's movements, whether that be more or less. Then we asked them what was your response to the change, and this was actually really concerning for us because we had a whole heap say that they didn't worry, and we think that that's probably because they didn't know to worry. They hadn't been told to worry if their baby changed movement. They mentioned it to their family and friends but didn't worry any further. So that's the whole ringing up mum, baby's moving less, and mum saying, don't worry about that, that's normal, baby's getting ready for birth. Baby's not moving as much as it's running out of room. Those myths. Mention it to their care provider and we're reassured. That's really concerning. We've got 30% of the people with reduced movements and 27% with increased movements saying there's something wrong with my baby, and the care provider saying, nah, it's okay, don't worry about that. Then we've got assessment happening. So 61% of that cohort had an inappropriate response to their baby's change in movement, whether that be because they didn't know to worry or whether it be because their healthcare provider falsely reassured them. Then if we move into the case control data, we've actually got some really interesting findings. Just want to point out that p-value. You haven't done foundations of research yet, but the p-value is a probability value, and the lower it is, the more likely it is that the thing that you found is not due to chance. So the more zeros, basically, as a general rule of thumb, the more significant it is. So if you see that p-value 0066, that's a really significant value. So then if we asked, during the pregnancy, did your healthcare provider tell you about or ask you to keep track of baby's movements? And we've got a significant difference, strongly significant difference between what the cases said and what the controls said. The controls, the live-born controls, were much more likely to say yes to that question than the stillborn cases. So again, that confirms you have to talk to your women. It makes a difference. Keeping track, again, strongly significant. Did you keep track of your baby's movements during the pregnancy? The cases were much less likely to say yes to that question. How they kept track was interesting to us. There was a lot of kick counting going on. A lot of use of apps, which is interesting. There's a lot of apps being developed worldwide, and a lot of women using them in pregnancy to reassure themselves. General awareness of their baby's pattern of movement, so that's the whole getting to know your baby sort of stuff. Noticing that the baby was moving constantly, so not too concerned about keeping track, just because they thought, well, the baby's moving constantly, I don't really need to worry. And stimulating the baby, and I've got cold water there because that's how most women said that they stimulated their baby to move. More about that in a minute. So if you compare the cases and the controls, you'll see, very interesting, that the biggest difference between the cases and the controls and how they kept track was the cases were much more likely to say, my baby was pretty active, I didn't really need to keep track because my baby was active anyway. And it's interesting that the controls were much less likely to say that that's how they kept track. So it seems like just saying the baby's pretty active, I don't need to be concerned, isn't a good thing to do. We need to be saying to our women, get to know who your baby is, how your baby is, and immediately report a change to us. Change in the usual pattern of movement, we have a very strong association, the highest p-value that is possible to get for this question, with the cases saying that their baby was much more likely to be moving significantly less, nearly 13 times the risk, and significantly more, nearly 6 times the risk in change in pattern in movement. Really very telling data, really very important data that we're aware of as midwives. If you talk about a change, what we analysed was the comment data. So within this particular survey, what we did was we had Likert scales and yes-no questions, and alongside those scales and questions, we actually had the opportunity for the women to respond in comments. And then we did a comment data analysis where we looked for recurring words and phrases. So within that comment data, the recurring word and phrase that we heard most often from the cases was that the baby moved less gradually over the days, weeks and months prior to the birth. There was a gradual reduction in movement. The next one down, baby had 1 or 2 days when less movement was noticed. None of the cases said that. Whereas the controls did. The controls said, my baby had a day where it moved less, it freaked me out, I went to the hospital, we did a CTG, all was well, and it didn't happen again. So that tells us that the baby at risk of stillbirth is much more likely to gradually drop off in their movements. And probably almost not noticeably, perhaps. Whereas if the baby is well, then the baby can have a quiet day. And if you think about ourselves, we can all have a quiet day where we just want to lie in bed and have a bit of a relax for a day. So this is, we think, indicative of what's normal for a fetus and what isn't. So gradual moving less is the baby probably going, running out of placenta, running out of supply, need to move less to conserve energy and trying to make it through to birth. Whereas the baby who's well is the one who has 1 or 2 days and then comes back to normal movement for the rest of the pregnancy. So this isn't information that I would necessarily give to a woman, but it's certainly information that you should have in the back of your minds as midwife care providers. And the other interesting thing about a change comment data was the time of day that they talked about the change. So the cases were much more likely to say, my baby was less active in the morning towards the end of the pregnancy. So they would say things like the baby gradually moved less, and it was particularly noticeable in the morning. Or my baby gradually moved less and stopped kicking me to death when I was going to bed at night. Whereas the controls were much more likely to say, my baby became more active at certain times of the day. So they would say the baby didn't really change movement much, but it became more active in the morning, or noticeably more active in the evening. So again, fetal movement at bedtime This again was an extremely interesting finding. So that top question, do you usually feel your baby move at bedtime? It was non-significant between the cases and the controls. So if we see 96% of the cases and 96% of the controls. So pretty even between the cases and controls, saying their baby normally moved at bedtime. But the interesting difference is that strongly significantly difference in the question below, where you see, did you feel your baby moving at bedtime on the last night of this pregnancy? And we've got a strong response from the cases saying no, and the controls kept on with that strong answer, yes. What do we do with that information? Well, I'll ask the audience, what do you think we should do with that information? So when we ask the woman, she rings us concerned about reduced fetal movements. A really good question to ask her when you've asked the questions about parity and gestation is, did you feel your baby move at bedtime? Because that's a very strong indication that baby isn't well. Again, not something that we would tell her, but it's something that we need to bring into our practice. Time of death. This is from the cohort study that we've published already. So this is available in an open access journal. If you have time, in your ample spare time, you can read it. But basically what we found there was that 40% of the women thought that their baby died overnight. Again, a really interesting finding that the unborn babies are vulnerable as the mother sleeps, apparently. So then we asked about change in strength, and we said during the last 2 weeks, because we didn't want it just about the night before the baby died, we wanted it about the last couple of weeks of pregnancy. And remember, these are women who are recalling events within the last month, because they're the case control group. So we've got the cases being statistically significantly much more likely to say that their baby decreased in the weeks before the birth, not only in volume but also in strength. So they talked about the baby's movements became weak, fluttery, that sort of thing. They're talking about strength. Whereas the controls talked about an increase in strength. So they talked about powerful, stronger, harder. Again, substantially, significantly different words and phrases that these women are using. And again, we can bring this into our midwifery practice really easily. If we ask, tell me about your baby's movements, and the woman replies, baby's moving a little bit less, it's getting a bit weak and fluttery. Warning. Change in vigour, a really interesting question. We asked during the last 2 weeks, did you notice any time when your baby was more vigorous than usual? And again, strongly statistically significant for the cases who said, my baby went crazy. My baby had an episode where the baby went crazy, wild, nuts, bananas, berserk, ballistic, words like that. The cases the controls, only one of them used those words. And if you look at what she said, she was a near miss, in my view, because she said, the baby went crazy, it worried me, I went into hospital, they did a CTG, the baby wasn't well, and I had an emergency caesarean section. Lots of in the audience. So again, a warning sign for us that baby isn't well. If she rings you up and says, my baby just went crazy, don't reassure her that her baby's a footballer. Ask her to come on in. And the last thing that we found was hiccups. So again, really interesting. If you look at the top question, did you experience hiccups? Then you can see that there's absolutely no difference between the cases and the controls. We're saying, did you experience hiccups in the pregnancy? And that's reassuring to us because that means that the data weren't necessarily skewed or biased by the fact that the women knew that they'd had a stillbirth. So both the cases and the controls reported at pretty much the same levels that their baby hiccuped, and that's completely normal. Hiccups are completely normal and physiological response. It's getting ready for birth and breathing after birth, so completely normal. The thing that was different between the hiccups between the cases and the controls was the length of time that the baby hiccuped for and how often they noticed them. So you can see on this table that if the baby hiccuped for greater than 5 minutes on a daily basis, then that woman was at increased risk of stillbirth. So again, tell me about your baby's movements. If she says, oh, the baby's been hiccuping a real lot lately, long time, hiccuping most of the day, daily, then again, that's a baby that needs to be investigated, as opposed to the one who's just going, oh yeah, hiccups, yeah, happening from time to time. That's the well baby. And then finally in this particular study we asked, did you ever during the pregnancy have a gut instinct that something was wrong? And in the case control data we've got strong correlation between the cases answer to that question and the controls. So the cases were far more likely to say yes to that question, and the controls were far less likely to say yes. They were much more likely to say no. How does that help us? Well, again, I think we need to ask. So there were themes within the intuition data, within the case control data, that were really quite interesting to us. Now, we didn't have a lot of controls because a lot of the controls said no. Interestingly, the cases said, we got 4 themes. So the cases said, I had a gut feeling that something was wrong throughout the pregnancy. So they said things like, just from the moment I got pregnant, I knew that there was something wrong. I thought perhaps that I was being stupid, anxious, first time mum. I mentioned it to my husband. He said, don't be silly, dear, you're okay. And so I tried to put it out of my mind, but then ended up with a stillbirth. Then there was a response to change in fetal movements. So these women tended to say, my baby's movements became weak and fluttery. I mentioned it to my care provider and they said, don't worry. But it made me think that there was something wrong. So that was in a direct response to the change in movement. And then there was an intuition occurring the night before the baby died. I went to bed thinking, oh, something just doesn't feel right. And the next morning, woke up and the baby was deceased. There would obviously, within that group, be a group whose baby was already deceased and perhaps they didn't know. But equally, within those stories, we saw things like, I went to bed, my baby's movements were weak and fluttery. I thought, well, when I wake up in the morning, I'll go to the hospital because things just don't feel right. And finally, due to something specific occurring, none of the cases said this, only the controls. So they said things like, I worried about fetal movements until my doctor told me my placenta was anterior, and then I didn't worry anymore. Or I worried about the pregnancy because I was bleeding all the time. Things like that. So we have, from this information and other information, a summary of the fetus at risk that we really need to bring into our minds as midwives and act upon. So the fetus at risk of stillbirth is one whose movement changes in the last 2 weeks of pregnancy to being significantly less or significantly more, who reports to you that their movements are weaker, who has one episode when the baby goes crazy, nuts, bananas, has periods of hiccups for longer than 5 minutes occurring every day, who doesn't move at bedtime and who dies overnight. The mother has a gut feeling that something is wrong and the care provider doesn't give them information. Before I move into what you've observed in practice, can I just get some feedback on that part of the presentation? What do you think?
Really informative.
Informative? Terrific, thank you. Really good question, and it's one that other people have asked me, and that is for the people listening at home. Do you think that the women who had a stillbirth are recalling that in retrospect as negative recall bias, we call it? Answer, yes. I do think that there's certainly a little bit of negative recall bias in there. However, it's a substantial response. And reading the questions, I think that if a woman is thinking to herself during pregnancy, oh, it just doesn't feel right, and she's talking to her care provider and her mother and being reassured by everybody, she'll remember that as this just doesn't feel right. The other thing is that within that cohort, one of our co-investigators actually asked that same question. I wonder if that increases with time. So women look back and go, it just wasn't right. However, it was remarkably consistent over time. So we actually looked at the differences over time because we could. Between the ones born 4 weeks ago and the one born 40 years ago, and there really wasn't any difference in that recall. The other thing that was interesting to us was that one of our investigators again said, I bet that's more prevalent in the multip than the primip. Interestingly, the reverse was true. It was more prevalent in the primips than the multis. Something doesn't feel right. First time pregnancy, really interesting. Any other questions about that? Okay. Who is now going to ask their women, tell me about your fetal movements? Thank you. That looks like just about everybody. What have you observed in practice? Can you just talk to your neighbour for a minute about what you've observed midwives telling women is normal? Talk. Who else has heard that the midwives say it's normal for the baby to move less close to term? Just about everybody in the room. As the baby runs out of room. Uh-huh.
I've heard more the movements should be the same, but they'll change the way they feel.
Okay. So you've heard the movements should stay the same number, but it can change how it feels.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah. I've heard a midwife tell a woman that actually an obstetrician tell a woman when she actually said, but it's less than a month ago, and they said, oh, it's just because the baby's getting bigger and you've got an anterior placenta, so.
Just to summarise that again, hearing obstetrician colleagues saying you're feeling less movements because your placenta is anterior, and in spite of the fact that she's going, nah, the baby's actually moving less, that obstetrician was reassuring her, nah, it's fine. You can't feel the movements because the placenta is at the front. Yeah. So what do we do? Can you just hold that thought, because I'll move to what we do in a second. But what do we do if the woman says, my baby just went crazy? In a nutshell, I think we should do exactly what we would do if the woman said, my baby's moving less. So we investigate in much the same way. Okay, so you might have noticed that myself and Pauline Glover have recently published a paper about South Australian midwives' knowledge and practice. We surveyed 72 midwives and we asked them what information they normally give, and they said things like, we just tell them that what to expect normally, count to 10 in a period of time. Problem with counting to 10 in a period of time was that they would say 10 movements. Well, you tell me, what have you observed as normal? Well, what have you observed our midwife colleagues talking about the number 10? 10 in an hour? 2 hours? 2 hours? Any advances on 2 hours? A day? So that's the problem. 10 in various different periods of time. when to contact, fairly consistent information. If you're concerned, contact us, but then very inconsistent information about what we do when they do contact us. And then asking them to keep kick charts. Have you observed our midwife colleagues giving out kick charts or giving information about kick charts? Lots of shakes of the heads in the room.
The only time I have, it was very blasé. Oh, by the way, it's probably good to keep an eye on your movements now and then on to the next topic. It wasn't actually discussed properly.
Okay, so very sort of offhand, here's a kick chart, you might want to use it, see you. Okay, interesting. So I want to demonstrate to you what's wrong with counting and 10 by showing you a video. It's of my unborn grandbaby Bethany, who's now 10 months old. It lasts for 16 seconds, so it's not long. But what I would like you to do is to count how many movements you see during this period of time. The dog doesn't count. Okay, how many? 3? 6? 8? Any advances on 8? How many? 10? Okay, so if we say to a woman, count fetal movements, and we can't agree in the room how many movements that was. By the way, a lot of my midwife colleagues would say that's 1. They would say that's 1 episode. Have 10 more of those in a day. But anyway, if we can't agree how many movements that was, and yes, granted, we're not in her body and she's breathing, so it's a little bit hard to count. But the bottom line is that we can't be saying to the woman, 10 is normal. What do we say to that woman? Let me tell you a little bit more about that situation. They live in Townsville, which is too far away. I was obviously concerned. She knew I was concerned. So she knew her baby. And she knew that if she lay down in that position at that time of the day and brought out her iPhone, that it would be a matter of seconds before Bethany started moving like that. So she did exactly that. She thought, right, Jane needs reassurance. I'm going to lie down on the couch, take a short video and send it to her. So that's exactly what she did. Now, imagine for a second that she lies down and she doesn't get the movements that she expects. So she rings up her hospital and says, my baby is moving less. And the midwife says, what's normal for you? And she'll say, well, I'm really not quite sure. Baby's normally really active. And the midwife says, sit down, have a drink of cold water, ring me back in an hour if you're still concerned. Would that be appropriate for her? She knows her baby. She's concerned about her baby. Her baby is moving less. So that's the problem. The problem is that we have women it is completely normal for their baby to move 10 times in 10 seconds, or 6 times, or 3 times, or however many we want to count. We need to be sure that we're not discounting their concerns if that doesn't happen for them. So final advice, what have you observed happening if a woman rings concerned about decreased fetal movements? Again, have a bit of a chat and we'll have a chat more broadly in a minute. So you're saying to me that we should listen to our women, respond to their concerns, and assess them. If they're concerned, then there's a reason for their concern that we need to get to the bottom of. So that's ideal. But I asked what is actually happening.
Quite dismissive.
Dismissive?
I've heard a story of a woman calling in saying she had decreased fetal movements. They said take a cold drink. She might outcome for her that the baby possibly could have still been alive when she called, but
So that's what we risk. We risk the woman being concerned about decreased fetal movements, us fobbing her off, her thinking, oh, well, I was just being a bit silly anyway, and then ending up with stillbirth. And us feeling pretty bad about that. Yes, thank you.
So I can't understand.
About the physiology of how cold water works. Absolutely. So you've heard it, and then in the back of your mind you're thinking, that doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
What's the physiology behind giving her cold
if you're sick
water?
lying in bed and you get given a cold drink, it's like, oh, okay, hang on, I'll react to that, and then I feel crap again. So,
Yeah, exactly. So if you're feeling sick, you're in bed, somebody gives you a drink of cold water, you might feel better for a minute, perhaps get out of bed, do a wee, then go back to bed and still feel bad.
We're discussing that in the
Myth. And it's quite disempowering for the woman to be told, well, you're concerned, but it's really because you were active and you weren't paying attention. That's not a nice thing to say to somebody, is it really, when you think about it? No, it's probably some other reason other than you being a concerned mum.
my mum had a
You mean? So you're wondering how we deal with the responsibility that we have for keeping the baby safe, and I'll talk about that in a second. So what I'm hearing from this audience is really confirming what we learnt in the survey, and that is that midwives will ask questions, so they'll say things like, you know, how pregnant are you? Were you busy today? Those sorts of questions. Some of the questions they asked actually didn't have much to do with anything at all. So they would say, you know, what did you have for breakfast this morning? Or some sort of unrelated thing. Then there would be this strong advice, monitor at home and call back. Suggest food and fluids and come in for testing. The come in for testing, unfortunately, was quite low. Only a few midwives said that. So that actually confirms other studies. McCargill and others did a study in 2015 at the Mater, where they showed in 526 women at 34 weeks gestation or later that 67% of them received information about fetal movements during pregnancy. 80% said they received this from their midwife. Yay! 2/3 of women agree that it was normal to feel reduced fetal movements towards the end of pregnancy. Uh-oh. And some groups, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups, 100% agreed that it was normal to feel baby movements. So it's quite strong in their culture. 65% would wait longer than 24 hours before seeking advice from their healthcare provider. Not good. 83% would normalise decreased fetal movements and not take any action. And as we saw in the STAR study, that's really not good. Only 1/3 agreed that being aware of fetal movements helps identify the fetus at risk, and I think that that's because we're not having the conversation. You know, it really behoves us to have that conversation with our women during pregnancy. New Zealand, our New Zealand colleagues, 97% of them reported that their lead maternity care provider regularly asked about fetal movements. Yes. 62% recalled receiving information from their lead provider about what to expect regarding fetal movements. That's good, but again, we've learnt from the study that we've just finished that that's not necessarily fantastic, because it will depend on what that care provider says is normal. So if she says it's, or he, if they say it's normal for the baby to move less close to term, then that's what the woman will believe is normal. 40% were advised to contact their lead maternity provider if they had any concerns. That's good, but what about the other 60%? And then they use that advice 10 and 10 in a day. So the study suggests that the proportion of pregnant women in Auckland don't have optimal information about fetal movements, And they suggested strategies for improving maternal knowledge, such as a pamphlet. But also, I would say, the care provider really needs to be having a chat and asking her, tell me about your baby's movements. So the myth, it's normal to feel less movement close to the end of pregnancy. That's absolutely busted. Fetal movements do not normally decrease close to term. In fact, decreased fetal movements at or near term places the pregnancy at substantial increased risk, and we've got multiple studies that say that. So that is a busted myth. What's wrong with asking a woman to drink something cold or sugary and ring back? Well, some of the group alluded to it, not understanding the physiology behind how on earth a cold drink of water could change how the baby is feeling. So we've got that. How on earth, if you think about yourself, if you're sick with the flu, lying down in bed and somebody gives you a cold drink, it might make you feel better, but then again, it may not. And in any case, it's not going to improve your flu.
On that as well, I've seen women come in to be monitored and they've had them on a trace.
Is they've reported reduced fetal movements. Their trace looks flat. In order to improve their trace, they put them on the side, which is probably the physiology that's working. And, by the way, giving them a cold drink. The other thing is sugar. So have you heard midwives say, have a drink of orange juice or something really sugary?
Yeah, it's been
Lots of nods of head. Yeah. How do you think that physiology is supposed to work? Supposed to give the fetus a sugar high, thank you. Now, let's think about that physiology for a second. I'm pregnant, not really, too old. I have a drink of something really, really sugary. I'm not diabetic. Doesn't my pancreas kick in and send out a whole stack of insulin to deal with that sugar before it has a chance to get to the baby? So that can only possibly work if the woman is diabetic. And even then, it's not necessarily going to make the baby move. It is going to make the baby bigger. So we know the physiology behind that. We know that the baby has a normal pancreas. The baby will produce insulin and go around mopping up that sugar. And insulin is a growth hormone. So that's why we end up with a big baby.
Still, once again, that sugar might give it a high for that period of time.
Even if it did
And
work.
Then, and then...
Absolutely, you make a really good point. Should it happen that for some reason the woman is diabetic and the baby does have a bit of a sugar high as a result of that, does it make the underlying physiology of why that baby is moving less go away? So it provides us with false reassurance, doesn't it? So it's really not a good thing to do. It's not physiological. It delays the concerned mum from taking action. So what clinical guidance do we have for the management of decreased fetal movements? Well, we've got our PPGs. Who's had a look at reduced fetal movements in the PPG? So let's be honest. A few of you. Handful of you. Within the PPGs, there is this section about reduced fetal movements, and I want to point it out because it's really very interesting. First one, there's no universally accepted definition of reduced fetal movements. So that means we need to rely on what the woman tells us. If she thinks the movements are reduced, we are not in a position where we should say to her, nah, it's not 10, it's not this, it's not that, you've been busy, whatever. She says the baby's reduced movements, we believe her. The majority of women who perceive reduced fetal movements will have a normal outcome to their pregnancy. I think that that's worded really interestingly because 30% who perceive reduced fetal movements won't. And that's really concerning. That's higher than anything else that we're concerned about. High blood pressure, diabetes, cholecystosis of pregnancy. All of those things are much more rare than reduced fetal movements. There are no data to support formal movement counting, kick charts, after the woman has perceived reduced fetal movement. So there's no data whatsoever to say that we should tell a woman to count to movements after they have perceived a reduction. It's in the PPGs. Next one, there's no evidence to support advising women who report reduced fetal movements to have something very sweet or sugary to eat or an ice cold drink to increase fetal movements. It's in our PPGs.
So why isn't it practiced?
Why isn't it practiced? That's a really good question.
As in they refer to the PPGs for so many things, why don't they use that?
Absolutely. Why not? Why do you think that it's not practiced?
I don't know, people aren't up to date or
It could be that they're not up to date,
can't be bothered looking.
can't be bothered looking, think they know
Think it
what's,
works,
think it works.
because they do that.
It's what they've always done. Very, very hard to change habit. Very, very hard to change what's in the culture. So you learn something here, you go out into practice, they go, nah, don't do it that way. Do it this way. And you change your practice to perhaps something that isn't evidence-based. I think there's lots of reasons. I think it's really complex. Women who've had normal investigations after one presentation should be advised to recontact the hospital. I think that of all the advice, that's one that we do. They come in, they'll have a normal CTG. I reckon that most midwives that I've observed anyway, be interesting to hear your opinion, will then say, well, all's normal, but if it happens again, call me back. Yeah, lots of nods. I think we do that as a general rule. Not always, but I think of all of them, that's one that we do. So what do we do? I think it's really simple. I think we empower the woman. We're midwives. We're about empowerment and advocacy. We listen to her. She says, I'm worried. We go, I'm concerned, you're concerned. Invite her in. What's the cost? Appropriately respond to her concerns by thoroughly assessing the fetal well-being of that baby. So bringing into your vernacular, I'm concerned that you're concerned, come on in and tell me about your fetal movements rather than is the baby moving. Two things which I think if we all did, it would make a difference. And the reason why I think it will make a difference is the story about the starfish. If you've heard this story, have a little nana-nap for a minute. But a lot of people haven't heard this story. So there was a story about a little boy who was walking along a beach after a storm and picking up starfish and tossing them back in. And an older bloke came along behind him, saw what he was doing and said to him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Saving starfish." And the bloke went, "But look at all the starfish on the beach. You can't possibly hope to save them all." And the little boy said, "Made a difference to that one." Okay, so if you make a difference to one, and you make a difference to one, and you make a difference to one, together we can make a big difference to the number of starfish that are on the beach. Any other questions? Yeah. At the PPGs, the guidance is CTG and then ultrasound. Unless
Do they do
I think that what we do as midwives is say, the woman's come in for reduced fetal movements. The CTG was a bit dodgy. I needed to put her on her side and give her a drink of water in order to get the baby to move normally. I'm ordering an ultrasound.
So putting
No, physiologically, that if we put a woman in left lateral, that improves fetal well-being often. And it's because we're releasing pressure from the inferior vena cava.
And that's why a lot of deaths may happen overnight because of the way they're sleeping, or what?
Yes. So we think the vulnerable baby is vulnerable to supine sleep position. And that baby may be the baby who's failing to grow or failing to move. The woman sleeps for a time on her back, and that vulnerable baby can't cope with that reduction in blood flow. That's what we
so
think.
if you did see a portion.
If you see somebody is on their back and their trace is poor, you move them to left lateral and the trace looks better. Do you still order the ultrasound? And the answer is yes. And I would also add information to that woman and say, it seems to me like your baby doesn't like it when you're on your back. When you're sleeping, can you do two things for me? Settle to sleep on your left, and when you get up overnight to go to the loo, go back to sleep on your left. Because we know from our studies that that improves the amount of time spent sleeping on the left. I don't know why the baby's vulnerable, and unfortunately the baby doesn't go, I'm vulnerable. They don't have a sticker on their forehead. Wouldn't that be neat? The other thing is that you would have observed in practice by now that babies are amazingly resilient, thank God. So you would have seen horrible fetal distress, and the baby's born and the baby's absolutely screaming, yeah? I think it's the same thing with this. I think the babies are amazingly resilient, and just because they get by with reduced fetal movements doesn't mean they were well, just means that they were well enough to escape, resilient enough. We shouldn't have an attitude of fear about this, but we certainly need to have awareness and protection and empowerment and advocacy. We need to be thinking about those things. We do spend an inordinate amount of time educating about about diabetes and high blood pressure and signs for the woman to look out for. So it would be very remiss of us to say things like, you got a headache? Just take a Panadol. Don't worry about that. You'd be looking for other signs, wouldn't you? What else has she got? She got a bit gastric pain too? Got a bit of edema? Ooh. Let's just check her protein in her urine. Let's assess her. Not just say, headache, yeah, okay, that's normal in pregnancy. So we spend time protecting women in that way. We also spend time protecting women with respect to not drinking alcohol. And fetal alcohol syndrome is so much rarer than stillbirth. Even in a woman who drinks like a drinker, a fish, thank you. So we have a disproportionate thing here. And Claire thinks, and I really agree with her, that some of the reason for this is that if you have fetal alcohol syndrome, the way to prevent it is for the woman not to drink alcohol. If you have high blood pressure, then there's a range of treatments that we know work to reduce that, and then we've got delivery as well. Stillbirth is much more complex. So yes, we can manage reduced fetal movements, but we could end up with a stillbirth anyway. It's a complex issue, and it also causes anxiety. So I think in America, just for the tape, who woke up, felt different, no fetal movements, did the drink, still no movements, called the midwife. She said, wait an hour. She didn't do it, went to hospital, had the assessment, horrible CTG, dreadful ultrasound, emergency caesarean section, live baby. So that's what we can achieve. And again, Claire and I have got stories that we could tell you, endlessly probably, about that kind of thing, where the woman hasn't listened, has advocated for herself and her baby, and has missed out, we think, on stillbirth as a result. So it's perfectly possible to prevent stillbirth.
How do we get around?
How do you get around colleagues who aren't listening and aren't responding appropriately to women? Remember the starfish story is all I can say. So make a difference where you are. Don't adopt their behaviour. And see if you can have a quiet word with the woman before she goes, saying, I'm still concerned about this baby. feel free to come back. And then hopefully another midwife will assess that woman when she comes back.
Can you go to another level?
It's really important to empower the woman to advocate for herself in that situation. So you
Try and get her to demand.
try and get her to demand it. In much the same way as we can empower her to avoid a caesarean section or avoid an instrumental birth or avoid other kind of forms of intervention. If we're the ones with the rapport, then I would urge you to step in and empower her to advocate for herself and her baby. Won't always be successful, in much the same way as it's not always successful if we are looking at someone who's heading for an instrumental that we believe isn't necessary. It's not always successful to say to the woman, listen, ask for another half an hour for yourself. That woman may or may not listen to you. Similar in this situation. But at least at the end of the day, you've then know that you've done everything in your power to keep her and her baby safe. Shall we finish on that note? Thank you very much for your attention and your questions. It was very good.